Let's go to the next screen so we can. Let's get right on. Okay. Ooh, okay. Hang on. We actually have to present the daggum thing. Okay.
We are professionals.
Obviously. Oh God.
Okay.
You went back too far.
I think we're good now.
It's sticky keys. Well, without any further ado, welcome. Good evening, everybody. I'm Mason at Independence Regional Library. Thanks for being here. I'm going to let Janice in. Hello, Janice.
I got her.
All right. This is History's Mysteries, March 31st. Welcome to, thanks for joining us. History's Mysteries, March 31st. We're here to talk about the Donner Party. Good evening. Tonight we are encouraging you to bring your thoughts and impressions and imagination and your concerns to the topic of the Donner Party, the myth and reality of this tragic episode in American conquest. Like I said, I'm Mason at Independence Regional. I'm here with Bobby and Tiffany and all of you. The story of the Donner Party, if we're familiar with it at all, we've become more familiar with it through researching for this, and it's far darker and more disturbing than we could have ever thought. It's a story of ambition and suffering. It's conquest of the American West. It's a story of enterprising gamble for to settle the American West with European pioneers. And it's ambitious at the beginning and it's desperate at the end. There's endurance, the settlers who plowed the fields when things were good ended up building shelters to die in the snow when things were bad. They sent parties that were fated to die to climb frozen rocky walls for rescue without shoes. And there's discipline involved. There's admirable traits to these pioneers. They called themselves immigrants. The discipline that I'm envious of, some of these folks kept journals in their beautiful cursive scrawl, even at death's door, for the sake of posterity. And there's hubris involved, of course, because all of Manifest Destiny was hubris. And this is one of the most tragic and perverse conclusions to that strange addiction to consuming the land. I hear a lot of fuzz. Is it the rain?
I hear that too.
It's a stormy night.
It stopped.
I'm so glad. Okay, I'm so glad it's a stormy night. If we need the rain, I'll go outside. But the question is, why is this particular story associated with this name figure so prominently? And it seems to me, if I'm going to introduce it, to just be a story of addiction to excess. These are settlers who had prospered everywhere they staked a claim in the eastern states, and they just craved more. Even after they were successful entrepreneurs and landowners, they just craved what's over the horizon, and they consumed as they went with excess. And it strikes me that once the land stopped giving them more to consume than they turned to this need to strive and continue and use calories and build and push, and it turns to consuming the cattle that pulled their wagons, to consuming the dogs, to needing more and more as they burned through all of this thirst and hunger to the point where they were consuming. That's where we get into the darkness of consuming strangers and friends and family, and it's troubling and it's legendary. And also it's the story of horrible entrepreneurship gone wrong, because a lot of it was based on the writings of Langsford Hastings, who, without researching it, published an entire guide to how to go from Missouri to California without ever having made the trip directly that way himself. So it seems like this was a party following a travel guide that was written to guide you straight into hell. So buy that book. And as always, we welcome all your thoughts and impressions and your contributions and your imagination to try to bring this material to life. We encourage healthy dialogue during the course of this hour. And without further ado, let's learn about the timeline of the Donner Party from Bobby Morris.
Hi. Okay, so since Mason had to take control of the PowerPoint since we were having issues, I'll try to direct you along, okay? So we could go to the first slide. So it all started with a book called The Immigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. And at the height of westward expansion, Lansford W. Hastings, he was a 27-year-old lawyer from Mount Vernon, Ohio. And he dreamed of taking California from Mexico and becoming Mexico's leader. He also published The Immigrant's Guide to Oregon and California in anticipation of doing that. He said that he had found a new, faster route to the west. It was a shortcut no one had ever seen, including Hastings himself. He had never actually traveled the route, as Mason mentioned. Despite the obvious risk and against the warnings of James Kleiman, who was an experienced mountain man, the Donner-Reed Party, they've become known as the Donner-Reed Party, shortened to the Donner Party because those were the richest, wealthiest families in the group. They decided to gamble on the Hastings Cutoff, and that decision proved disastrous. Hastings claimed that his route would remove 300 miles from the distance to Sutter's Fort, which was the last fort that settlers would see before going out into the wild. He said that the desert was only 40 miles across. It was actually 80 miles across. He said that they would find water within 24 hours, but it was more like 3 days before they finally came across water. And he also told George Donner and James Reed, the leaders of the Donner Party, that several wagon trains had already opted for this route and had loved it. This was a lie. He was just trying to make money. As Mason said, he was trying to build some wealth for himself. And the route was barely passable on foot and completely impassable for a wagon train, especially after September, which is when the winter started. I enjoyed watching it. It helped me understand the kind of landscape that they were attempting to cross. Yeah. So that's a good slide. Go ahead. So we're going to talk about a little bit who was in the Donner Party. So it was organized by James Reed. He was already a wealthy businessman. He was hoping to prosper more in California. And the nucleus of the party was from Springfield, Illinois. And that was George Donner. So sometimes they call it the Donner Party. Sometimes they call it the Reed Party. Sometimes it's the Donner-Reed Party. And it's because they were the wealthiest and the most respected people in the party. George Donner brought his brother, Jacob Donner. The entire James Reed family came along. They brought all of their hired hands. At that time, when they first set out from Springfield, Illinois, there was about 33 of them. And then they joined a larger wagon train, which was captained by William Russell. And Other important families on the route include the Murphys, the Breens, and the Graves. The Edys and the Kesebergs were lesser known families, but they were also part of the group. So they ended up being a wagon train of about 87 people in the 23 wagons. And Mr. Reed had a wagon that was specially built for the trip, and it was called the Palace Wagon because it was basically a house on wheels. And as things went downhill for the Donner Party, he eventually had to abandon this wagon and all of the supplies and the goods that they brought. It also created some tensions in the group. There were some less wealthy people, and they resented the fact that people like James Reed and George Donner had brought all of this wealth with them. Although in the end, it didn't really help them very much. But and a fun fact that I discovered while I was doing research is Abraham Lincoln was a good friend of Charles Reed, and he briefly considered going on the trail with them. He was going to move to California. Thankfully, he didn't, because he became our president instead. But there is a documentary. It's by Rick Burns, who is the brother of Ken Burns, and it came out in 1992. And it's a wonderful documentary. You can actually watch it on the Films on Demand, which is through the library. And I was going to play just a couple of clips from that film. I think it's on the next slide. Oh, actually, this is just the Donner Party Trail, and I just did a timeline so you guys could kind of see. Before we go to the clip, I'll just talk about this a little bit. Started in April, and that was actually a month late in the season, which is considered dangerously late, actually, because you want to get across the mountains before the winter, before the snows start. And the sweet spot for departure was usually sometimes in mid to late April, but for the unknown reasons, the core of what became the Donner Party didn't actually leave the jumping off point of Independence, Missouri until May 12, 1846. And they expected to be met by Lansford Hastings in Fort Laramie, and they were upset to learn that Hastings had left a week earlier with a different wagon train, and he hadn't told them he was going to do that. And so in August, after they had crossed the desert, they found a note saying that it was from Hastings, saying the cutoff is impossible. Two men rode ahead and confronted him, and he just basically just said, "My bad. You guys are on your own. You can turn around or you can cross the mountains." And so the
thanks
man
for buying my book.
Yeah, thanks for buying my book. And basically the man who put them on this disastrous path abandoned them. And then they were left to the elements. If you go to the next slide, Mason, I think the video, everything went wrong. That's what we're about to get into now. We can. We can. So as the travel conditions worsened and the nerves started to fray, a lot of bad things started happening among the people in the group. When they were crossing that awful desert we saw the clip of, most of the oxen died. Those that didn't die had to be mercifully killed because they could not handle the heat. Wagons had to be abandoned, including the Palace wagon that Charles Reed had. And that's when people started to realize they hadn't brought enough supplies for the trip, because they had been lied to by the person who wrote the guidebook. There were poor members of the family of the wagon train who started to resent Charles Reed and George Donner. Some of the families didn't want to share their food with the lesser families, so tension started breaking out about that. An elderly gentleman, this is one of the saddest stories, I think. After they got through the desert and they were heading toward Truckee Lake, people were really starting to cut their supplies down, trying to save as much as possible. And one of the families, I think it was the Breens, had taken in an elderly gentleman he didn't have a family, but he wanted to go to California. And they just abandoned him, left him on the side of the road and said, we can't support you. And none of the other families would take him in. And they found his body sitting by the side of the road several months later by other travelers. He just basically sat down and died because he didn't have any other options. So these were all really bad omens. But then things got worse. Charles Reed murdered a man named John Snyder. John Snyder was not very popular within the Donner Reed party. James Reed was, but there was some altercation that it was basically a wagon train rage, wagon crash rage incident. Their wagons had gotten entangled somehow, and Snyder had gotten a whip out to start beating the animals, and this made Charles Reed angry. And then Reed's wife apparently tried to intervene and accidentally got hit with the whip. So then he was angry that Snyder had hit his wife. And so he ended up stabbing him and killing him. And so this was the leader of, like, the co-leader of the Donner Party. And people didn't know what to do. They didn't know whether they should hang him, whether they should take him to California or put him on trial. He had a wife and 4 children. Of course, they were like, please don't do anything to him. And they decided to let him go off on his own without any supplies, although his wife and his children snuck him supplies before he left. So he was on foot by himself, and he actually went ahead and saw what they were facing and then made it to California and tried to get people to come back and help them because he knew what was going to happen. And nobody would do anything for 4 months. It took them 4 months to get somebody to come back to the mountains. Go to the next slide. I think there should be a link to the video. If you click that yellow hope right there.
Yeah, okay.
That is, I believe, the video about.
That's great.
The Rick Burns.
Oh, all right.
Anybody can watch this through the library's website. I highly recommend it. It won some awards the year it came out. It is older. It came out in 1992. And the clip that we want to look at, Mason, is clip number 16. It's about James Reed being banished from the party. And this was a very dramatic moment for them because he had been one of their leaders.
By the time they get certainly under the Humboldt River, tempers are pretty frayed. Very easy to trigger off, and there's a lot of incidents, anger. Again, I think that's a human condition when we're under an enormous amount of stress. Very often that can bring out the most heroic in us, and it can also bring out, the worst in us.
On October 5th, the immigrants were doubling their teams up a steep sandy hill when the Graves family wagon became entangled with the Reed wagon. Tempers flared, and the Graves driver, John Snyder, began beating the oxen with the butt of his bullwhip. James Reed hurried over to stop it, but only enraged Snyder further, who struck him savagely on the head with his whip. Reed drew his hunting knife, and as Snyder raised his arm to strike again, drove it into the teamster's chest, just below the collarbone. Snyder staggered a few yards up the hill and died.
Mr. Reed and family were taken to their tent and guarded by their friends. An assembly was convened to decide what should be done. The majority declared the deed murder and demanded retribution.
A German immigrant named Louis Keseberg propped his wagon tongue on end and demanded that Reed be...
Yeah. So the next part of that clip was intense. And this was really the beginning of the end, I think, for them. That was October is when things went terribly wrong. Louis Keseberg, he comes up a couple of times in this story. He was a German immigrant. He was also not very well liked because he was accused of beating his wife, and people in the party did not appreciate that. He wanted to hang Charles Reed, and if he had had his way, he would have done it. And it's very interesting, his reaction to that situation, considering what he does as things get more desperate. But basically by October 31st, the group had gotten to what is now called Donner Lake. At the time it was Truckee Lake. And they thought they could just get over the mountains, although they wouldn't have been able to get over the mountains with their wagons, but they had a better chance without snow. It still would have been very difficult and maybe impossible. But they decided to spend several days waiting at the bottom of the mountain pass because George Donner had broken an axle on his wagon, And while he was trying to repair it, he had cut his arm. And of course, there's very little medical help or even medical supplies out here. So it became very infected, and he became very sick. So the party moved ahead, but they didn't cross the mountains until they were hoping the Donners could join them. Unfortunately for them, it snowed 5 feet that night, and then the summit was completely uncrossable. And that was the moment that their chance of getting over the mountains before winter set in. And so they had low supplies, but they had no choice but to return back to what was then called Truckee Lake. And they prepared to make camp. They spread out several miles around the lake. They weren't all together. Some of the families tried to find rocks that they could pitch tents next to. Others cut down trees to try and build these makeshift huts. If you go to the next picture, I think, Mason, go to the next one. There's some photos of like, so this is the picture at the bottom of the screen. That is Truckee Lake. That's what it would have looked like coming across. The doll in the picture, in the middle picture, was actually a doll that belonged to Charles Reed's daughter. And she kept that with her all through the horrible ordeal. The rather gruesome picture on the left is an artist illustration of what they found when they came upon the remains of the Donner Party. And this was another illustration on the right of just them trying to survive with, as you can see, very little supplies, just like a little fire and some tents. So pretty quickly, hunger set in. That was their biggest issue. They ate all the remaining oxen that they had left, which wasn't many. They ate their dogs. Then they began gnawing on leather and dried hides that was usually made for tents. So they're basically eating tent material to try and stay alive. Elizabeth Donner, George Donner's daughter, she was a small child, and she remembered eating a lot of bark and trees. That's what she told people when she grew up. The first person to die from lack of food was a young man named Bayless Williams. I think he was about 12 years old. And he died on December 15th. And that was just a month and a half after they had been snowed in. And the really bad stuff hadn't happened yet. The snows were going to get a lot worse. It was the worst winter, I think, recorded in Nevada. They said the snow was 6 graves deep, is how they described it. And it stayed frozen like that the whole winter. If you want to go back a slide, Mason.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for doing this, by the way.
Yeah.
So they knew they were in big trouble. They knew they had to get some help. So they picked 17 people that they called the Forlorn Hope, which I found out is a military term. It's basically a term used to describe a suicide mission. That's what they referred to it as. So they knew things were pretty bleak. And the 17 people that they chose to help was mostly women. There was one child and a couple of men, and they were each given a blanket, a ration of food that was supposed to last 6 days, but this is what they took with them: a strip of stringy dried beef, a little sugar, and a little coffee. And that's it. That's all they had for what they were anticipating to be a 6-day journey. It was actually much longer. And they had fashioned some snowshoes. Somebody had learned about snowshoes from Native Americans. So they tried to make snowshoes. The 2 people who didn't have snowshoes turned back the first day. They knew that they could not make it across the snow. It was so deep at that point. So they ran out of food pretty quickly. 3 days after they ran out of food, people started to lose their minds, basically. Their Indian guides, they had 2 guides that they had hired to take them over the mountains. They were abandoned. The guides abandoned them when they heard that people in the Donner Party were considering killing them for food.
Yeah.
And they were shocked and said, "We're out. Good luck." And they did not survive. They were found later. There's different accounts of what happened to them. Some people say the Donner Party found them and killed them and then ate them. Other people say they just walked off and got lost, because even though they knew the area well, it was just, there's so much snow that they got lost in that area. So the Rick Burns documentary talks about the Forlorn Hope a lot better than I do. So go ahead and click that yellow hope button. Unless you still had it. You may have had it pulled up. Oh,
I
go back to the
did.
other. Do you still have the other screen?
Let me try it one more time.
Technology.
Hang on.
I can tell you what happened if it doesn't work. I just thought the clip was more interesting than listening to me.
Yeah.
Okay.
I prefer listening to you.
Okay.
But I'm gonna see if I can find it. It's the link expired. That's interesting.
Sorry, folks.
No worries.
Well, I will go ahead and talk about what was happening. So Patrick Dolan was an Irishman. He was part of the Forlorn Hope. Immediately after they ran out of food, he was like, maybe we should kill somebody and eat them. And the other people in their group were like, it's a little too soon to be talking about that. But when they ran out of food, they said, okay, let's draw straws. Whoever has the longest straw, that person will die. And we'll have to eat them. And Patrick Dolan drew the longest straw, and he was like, maybe we should wait. Because he didn't want to be eaten.
Guys, wait a minute. Let's think about this for a second.
Yeah, he's like, maybe I was a little too hasty for that. But sadly, he was the first person, as people started to lose their minds, he was the first person to lose his mind. And he eventually drifted off into a coma, and he was the first person to die. And he became the first person they cannibalized. And there's a great book about the Donner Party that the library has. It's called The Indifferent Stars Above. And the description of this moment is just, it's one of the saddest things I've ever read. He talks about how the survivors talk about how, they butchered the body and they cooked it over a fire. And they were all so ashamed that they went to like different corners of the woods and ate it because they didn't want to see each other eating it. And that they were all crying as they were doing it. But they literally, it was either eat that or die. And that's the decision that they had to make. And then later that night, things got even worse. There was an incredibly heavy snowstorm. And one of the men, I cannot remember which man it was, but he came up with the idea of having everyone sit in the middle and then draping like a blanket over them, and their bodies would sort of hold it up like a tent, and that the warmth would stay in. And even with that, 7 people still died that night. And those families, these were all family members. These were people who knew each other well. And with the 7 bodies, they decided that they would butcher them, and then they labeled the meat so no one would have to eat their relatives, which is a pretty terrifying thought. Back at the lake, while the Forlorn Hope is out there going through all this horrible stuff, at the lake things are getting really bad too. December was probably the bleakest month for the Donner Party. Many people died. Patrick Breen kept detailed diaries detailing the horrors that happened. His diaries are actually available online and through the library. A lot of the original diaries and documents are public records, so you can read them. While the Forlorn Hope had started cannibalism pretty early, the group back at the lake, they held off as long as they could. But by the time the Forlorn Hope reached California, it wasn't until February that a search party came back. There were 3 search parties. The first one came back in February. And by that point, cannibalism had set in because they had nothing else to eat. And so basically the people who died kept those who were still alive. So we talked about Charles Reed earlier. So Charles Reed, he had, because he was turned out of the group, he had gone ahead to try to get to California, and he had seen what they were facing, and he had immediately gotten to California. I think it was the end of October, and said, there's a wagon train. They're going to get stranded out there. People are going to die. And no one really listened to him or took him seriously. And it wasn't until the Forlorn Hope, they did, I think 8 people finally made it to California.
Wow.
And they got the first party to come out, the first search party. And Charles Reed went with him. And by some miracle, all of his children and his wife had survived. And his wife actually heard his voice, and like they said, her head literally popped up out of the snow and was like, am I dreaming? Did I die? Is that my husband? He's finally here. And so Charles Reed took his family and his children back, and they took about 28 children back through the first party, but they couldn't take everybody back. They didn't have enough supplies. And that's when we get to the really grisly part of the story. Just one more side note about Charles Reed. I couldn't find any information on whether he ever went to jail for murder. It doesn't look like that he did. I think because of his heroism later and the way that he tried to save the people in the Donner Party, they decided not to prosecute him. That's at least as far as I can tell. So we're getting to the end now. After James Reed rescues his family and the other groups, yeah, go ahead. I think there's another slide too. Go to, yeah. Okay, that's, go back. That's jumping ahead a little bit.
Yeah.
So there's still about 48 people left. It's mostly adults. And they send another search party. They take back everyone except for Tasman Donner and George Donner. George Donner is still very sick from the cut that he had suffered early on in the season, and his wife refused to leave him. She did send her children ahead, so all of their kids survived. And then Louis Kiesberg, who was the German immigrant that I mentioned, when they came back to rescue the last remaining members of the Donner Party, the only person they found was Kiesberg. And Tamsin Donner was dead. They said that they found her head in a pot. He said that he had eaten her liver. They accused him of murdering her, but he swore that she died, and that's when he ate her, that he did not kill anyone. But for some reason, a lot of people didn't believe that. And so Louis Kiesberg had this reputation as being basically like Hannibal the Cannibal of the Donner Party. And all of these articles were written about him and what a horrible person he was. But many, many years later, when he was old and his Tamsin Donner's daughter, it's hard to say, she met with Kiesberg, and he dropped down on his knees and said, I swear to you, I did not kill your mother. I ate her because I had to, but I did not kill her. And she said she believed him, but a lot of people suspected him of murder. And of the few remaining people that were there, they had all died too. And there was a lot of gore and a lot of bones. And they said Kiesberg was half mad when they found him and took him back to California. So his reputation is very bad after this all ends. So the whole ordeal was over by April. And the story of the Donner Reed Party spread all across the country. Newspapers printed all the letters and the diaries. And there were all sorts of wild tales about what happened, some of them true, some of them made up. Immigration fell sharply until the gold rush started. And then
Surprise.
But no one ever used the Hastings cutoff again. That essentially ruined Lansford Hastings' dream of making so much money off of that. Although he did fight in the Mexican War and he did help them win, so he did get to go to California and claim land. Tiffany she did some research on what happened to the survivors of the Donner Party, like what happened to them after this ordeal. And she's going to talk a little bit about that.
All right, Mason.
Okay.
Switch over to my slide.
Yeah, the bright one, that one.
That one.
The one with all the blood.
Yeah, the very intense.
Thanks, Tiffany.
The members and their fate. The total deaths counted was 42, and they had 47 survivors, so about 50-50. As you can see, this lists everybody that was part of the Donner Party, and everybody that is highlighted in red died. So obviously, if you were an individual, you did not have very good chances. But not very many people had great chances, it seemed like. So 5 of the immigrants died before reaching the mountain camps, 34 at the camps or on the mountains while attempting to cross, and 1 just after reaching the settlements. 2 men who had joined the party at the lake also died. So again, the total deaths was 42 with 47 survivors. At 13 years old, Mary Murphy became an orphan after her parents perished at the lake in the snowy Sierra Nevada Pass. Just 3 months after her rescue, and with no other option, she married a really abusive man. And in 1847, she wrote, according to the Indifferent Stars Above, like Bobby mentioned before, that book is really good detail. She wrote in it, "I hope that I shall not live long, for I am tired of this troublesome world and I want to go to my mother," which is just really sad to think about. After surviving her abusive first marriage, she married another man named Charles Kovold. He was a miner who ended up establishing the city of Marysville in California, which he had named for her. So hopefully it seems like her luck kind of turned around. And like Murphy, 20-year-old Mary Graves was also left an orphan, and she was forced to marry just 3 months after being rescued. And the next year, her husband, Edward Pyle, was murdered. And she was quoted as saying, "I wish I could cry, but I cannot. If I could forget the tragedy, perhaps I would know how to cry again." So that obviously they were scarred from this whole ordeal. Eliza Donner was 4 years old, and she was one of the last survivors of the Donner Party to be rescued from Donner Lake. She and her surviving sisters basically raised each other in the San Francisco Bay Area and until 1861, and that's when she married Sherman Otis Houghton, who was a widower of another Donner Party survivor. So that was interesting how that came back around. Houghton became mayor of San Jose and a U.S. congressman, and Donner went on to write a book about the Donner Party's demise, and she was quoted as saying, "Who better than survivors knew the heartrending circumstances of life and death in those mountain camps." And in 1911, she published the book, The Expedition of the Donner Party and Its Tragic Fate. So you can kind of see on the slide that there were some families that didn't lose anybody. So like how?
Yeah.
So there was only 2 families that survived the Donner Party without losing a single member, and that was the Breens, who refused to share their supplies with others, and the Reeds. So great people right there.
I'm surprised they weren't murdered, honestly.
I know. Me too.
It's your circle.
After James Reed stabbed and killed a fellow member of the Donner Party, the group banished him, and he managed to make it through the pass, and ended up rescuing them. And it just makes you really think how so many of them wanted to kill him, because he committed murder and everything. And if they had killed him, none of them probably would have made it, honestly. So it's funny how that comes around. What's really interesting is after their rescue, the Donner Party survivors became famous and then infamous, while a small number denied the tales of cannibalism. At least 8 survivors personally admitted to eating human flesh. And in 1884, Jean-Baptiste Trudeau told fellow survivor Eliza Donner that he witnessed no cannibalism. But in 1847, Trudeau confessed to rescuers that he had eaten human flesh. And rescuers even alleged that they saw Trudeau carrying a human leg. So,
Oh dear.
so I'm pretty sure he ate some people.
Yeah. I mean, of course they were going to deny it.
I mean,
Well,
timing. Yeah. timing is everything. If he was walking around Independence, Missouri with the leg,
Yeah.
and just brought it along with him,
I don't think that's what happened.
I don't think that, timing is everything.
So, yeah, you obviously don't want to be known as a cannibalist.
Oh, guy.
No, especially after, I know you're going to talk about Keseberg, but.
Yeah. And he was actually a teenager on this expedition. So, yeah, this is not a good time. So our most infamous villain, known as like the villain, was Louis Keseberg. In March 1847, when the third rescue team reached Donner Lake, rescuers discovered that the German immigrant Louis Keseberg, who had been traveling with his own family, had eaten 2 children. And the rescuers were reportedly forced to leave Keseberg and 4 other survivors of the Donner Party at the lake, as they were unable to transport everyone to safety, which, seems like a great plan since he's obviously okay eating people.
He's insane.
But when they returned on April 17th, Keseberg was alone, having eaten his remaining companions. I mean, who would have guessed that? Accused of cannibalism, murder, and stealing, German immigrant Louis Keseberg became the villain of the Donner Party. And upon his rescue in April, Keseberg also allegedly admitted to having cannibalized the body of Tamsin Donner, the wife of George Donner, even though she was relatively healthy and had stayed behind with her husband, who was too ill to travel. The rumors swirled that Keseberg had murdered her in order to eat her. Many gossiped that Keseberg bragged about having eaten human flesh and told some that Tamsin Donner's liver was the sweetest morsel he had ever tasted. It's great.
But again, we don't know if that's accurate. Like I mean, we think it is, and my gut kind of tells me these stories about him, or there's some truth in them, but he also, he became the villain. They love to write stories about him.
Yeah. He did say, I think they asked him, right, why Tamsin, and she was in good health and caring for someone.
She was very pretty, too. They said she was very attractive.
And she was in good health when they left, and I think he said that she fell in a creek,
right,
and that's how she died. But after a whole winter where everybody built cabins and survived under 20 feet of snow and everything else they endured, that just doesn't really hold any water, right?
I think he probably killed
fell
her
in the creek
because they said when they came back and found him, he was in the middle of committing some of this.
He was cooking.
Ghoulish, in the middle of an incredibly ghoulish act. So,
and they said he was pretty crazy when they found him.
Pretty crazy.
Yes,
well, and he didn't start out very good either, since he was a wife beater.
Yeah, he was a wife beater. He was mean to animals. He was foul mouthed. So he was already unpopular within the Donner Party, and which is why it was. I think it's why they didn't immediately hang Charles Reed. It's because people didn't like John Snyder and Louis Keseberg. Those were the 2 most unpopular people. And then he murdered John Snyder, and then Keseberg's like, we should hang him. And I think they just immediately just said no. Because they didn't like either one of the people involved with that.
Yeah.
But I also, I think that they didn't pursue murder charges because, like you said, Charles Reed probably saved a whole bunch of people.
Yeah. And in 1870,
oh God,
an author was actually researching the scandal, and he found Keseberg living in destitution and dismay. The man's reputation had tormented and ostracized him, leaving him widowed and caring for 2 mentally disabled daughters who he was known for bashing and saying that they were stupid and useless and everything. So he was just not a good man. The author arranged for 2 survivors of the Donner Party to reconnect, and it just happened to be Eliza Donner, who was 4 years old when her mother Tamsin sent her away with the rescue party, and Keseberg, the man that was accused of murdering her. But again, like Bobby said, at their reunion, Keseberg fell to his knees and swore that he did not kill her. Though, of course, he wouldn't deny eating her remains. It'd be kind of hard to deny that after you eating.
They found him in the act of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then he could, where else could he be found in his infamy afterwards, Tiffany?
Yes, please share this. This is the weirdest tidbit I think of.
Well, before we get to that, I will say that Eliza was a stronger woman than I because she forgave him. And she was just like, you know what? You know, let bygones be bygones. It's fine. So Keseberg is remembered as a classic villain of the West. Reputation he did little to dispel in his lifetime. The self-confessed cannibal managed to further outrage the public by opening a restaurant in Sacramento. Rumors began to circulate that Keseberg was bragging to his drinking buddies that human liver was the sweetest tidbit he had ever tasted, and they let this man open a restaurant.
And a brewery. It was a brewery. It was a microbrewery.
And supposedly a hotel, so I'm getting some Sweeney Todd vibes there.
I just can't believe that anybody ate there or drank the beer.
Yes, supposedly it was fairly popular restaurant. Everybody was cool with this somehow. I'm not cool with this. I'm pretty mad about it. So
the only reason it failed is because there was a flood. Was it a flood?
Yeah.
And it destroyed the business. And that's the only reason he went out of business.
Yeah. Everybody was just fine. They're like, oh, it's fine.
It's California.
Yeah. There wasn't enough people. They said that there wasn't enough people for them to really ostracize anybody. So everybody was just kind of accepted.
Yeah, it was pretty new. People were, they realized they had to get along.
Yeah.
Because they were in this new part of the country.
But whenever I found out that he opened a restaurant, I went stomping through the library, being like, "Who let this man have a restaurant?" So that's pretty much
very
all
gruesome. It's a very gruesome footnote to that whole story.
Yeah, I think maybe that people it's also going because that morbid fascination, ooh, that's a horrible tragedy, just being to be close to that. This person survived this horrible thing, and they might have done these horrible things. I said maybe kind of some messed up thrill of being close to someone like that might have done such terrible things.
I bet you're right. That probably was part of the allure of eating at that restaurant. I mean, it's crazy, but it's probably true.
Yeah, things in the present, where people, who are maybe still support people who've done terrible things, and it's why?
Yeah, I want to know if anybody ordered something, and if it tasted funny, that they looked around, being this doesn't really taste like pork, guys.
And we ran out of jokes about this at the library pretty quickly, but it got us through a morning meeting. It was. It's a now you all have this fact.
It's a very dark sense of humor at the library.
It lives rent free in our brains.
I will say, as I was researching this topic, I started eating a lot more vegetarian meals. It was not meat was not something I wanted to eat when I went home at night and cooked.
think we're going to be scarred for a little bit there.
Mm-hmm.
I am deeply scarred, and I hope you guys aren't as scarred as I am. I didn't go into a lot of the more horrific. I mean, it was bad all around, but there were some truly horrific details in the book that I read.
I just can't get over the trees. Mason, can you go back to that slide that has the trees?
Yeah, I think it's the third or fourth slide. It shows where they cut down the trees for firewood. Insane. Yeah, the starvation camp photo.
So the top of those trees is where they had built their cabins. That's how deep the snow was.
They built cabins on top of 20 feet of snow.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, it was the most insane winter that they had ever. I think it's still on record as the worst winter that they've ever had.
It didn't really connect with me. It tells you how much snow it is and stuff, but unless you have that visual, it doesn't connect. how much snow we're talking about. That's how deep it was. There's a person sitting next to this tree.
And it's like, what, I don't know, another 20 feet above him?
Oh my God, at least.
I mean,
like, it's
yeah.
insane.
The facts of like the grueling endurance of the all, like including like the wagon train, this moving city, because
and the desert
that was going west. And it takes me all the way back to where they were all pretty comfortably prosperous families in Missouri, right?
Don't blame the
They
victim.
they were
Blaming the victim.
and we all wonder, like, why did they build the giant wagon? Why and set out and making a mile a day, with.
Well, they also took a lot of rest stops too, and some people have blamed George Donner for that.
It took them days to get to move out of town and say goodbye, and people trailed after them to say bye bye, and it's this. Gosh, it was a moving city,
Yeah. Oh, we've got a comment.
Yeah, Linda, I was going to say.
Yeah, I just can't imagine being in that situation, especially with kids. I can't say what I would or wouldn't do to protect my family. Oh, seriously.
Yes.
I don't blame the people that were like, so I'm not sharing, just so you know. I don't blame them at all, but I'm just shocked that like other families didn't like try to steal or.
I am very surprised by that.
Yeah, it seems like almost a little too much. I mean, they're obviously not completely, but it's still like a little bit level, like, what's going on?
Yeah.
I just feel bad for like the kids and like you guys said like you said also like especially the two richest families brought like the help. I think more sorry for them.
Yeah, I mean, basically all of the hired hands and the help died because they didn't have the support. They didn't have the financial resources. They didn't have the family support that you would probably need to go through something like that, mentally just to get through it. Like the fact that Tamsin Donner kept all of her kids alive until almost the very end is amazing to me.
Yeah, that's really impressive.
Especially since her husband was out of commission from October on and, eventually died because that wound that he had, apparently it got deeply infected and he was basically useless. So she was the one like getting the firewood, building the tent, taking care of the kids, making sure that they were warm. And the fact that she was probably murdered by Keseberg, it just makes it even more tragic.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what I would have done though, because I was saying I would never eat what they did, but I was 10 minutes late for lunch the other day and freaking out. So, I mean, obviously after like, I don't know, 2 weeks without food, who knows what I would do.
You're like weeks late to Cali. Yeah.
That tent.
I would have gnawed on the tent for as long as possible, but I mean, eventually.
Yeah, and also I feel for the two native people that said that they hired and you still, even after they left, they still died. It's like,
Yeah, they did die. And there's different versions. I couldn't find the definitive version of that. They said one story was that that's the people in the Forlorn Hope followed them and killed them. And then other people said, no, they just found them and then they ate them. And then other people said they just died and their bodies were found later. So I don't know what happened exactly with the guides, but there was discussion about eating them and they were like, nope, we're out of here.
I recall the detail that they were conscientious objectors about the first.
They did not. They thought it was
time
crazy.
Yeah, they did not participate in cannibalism with the other folks in the Forlorn Hope.
They were horrified.
They were horrified,
like,
and
people are insane.
And they did what you're supposed to do, which is like, let's just ghost this whole party as quickly as we can, and it didn't. Who knows what crazy white people will do.
All right, guys.
I really think that's what they said.
Yeah.
It's 7:00. If you guys need to go, that's fine. We're more than happy to like hang out and talk with you guys. And there's feral children and any questions.
Again, we could not find substantial reports of feral children, but there were wild stories after the Donner Party that there were some children who were left behind and for several months, maybe 8, human flesh. There was one story of one of the younger children, after they got her to California, she would try to gnaw on your arm. And I think that's probably one of the wilder made up stories. But yeah.
No, kids bite all the time, so I kind of believe it.
They were insinuating she was trying to eat you because that's what she had witnessed as a child. That, you know, and that she wasn't quite right. That was never, and I don't know which child this was. So again, I feel like there would be more information if that was true. Now, they did say like Virginia Reed was deeply traumatized, and all the Donner girls were traumatized and would burst into tears for no reason all through their childhood.
Yeah, let's go back and look at that little doll.
Yeah, that doll is terrifying, but
Creepy.
that's Virginia Reed's doll, I think.
And she kept it with her the entire trip. The entire trip.
And that's a big deal because they were getting rid of as much weight as possible. So her father must have felt, you know, pity for this little girl and allowed her to keep her doll when they were getting rid of, you know, all their possessions. I think that's something.
This poor little girl that I've dragged away from a life of luxury and whatnot through the mountains and the desert, and you know,
the family trip.
She might deserve to have it all.
Yeah.
Do you guys have any thoughts about maybe what you would do in that situation?
No.
Please share.
I think at some point I would probably resort to cannibalism, but I'd try to like hold off as long as possible.
As long as I could find like something to chew on, I think I would wait. But I've never experienced that kind of hunger, so I cannot imagine what it might make you do.
Yeah. I heard it described that like this. There's been plenty of instances of extreme suffering and starvation, but not all of them have taken this perverse turn. But these folks were burning so many. What it was, the way it was explained to me is they were burning so many calories. You know, they were freezing, and they were still like they were taking care of each other. And the Forlorn Hope was climbing the side of a frozen rocky mountain, trying to get to
and like 20 feet snow
and 20-foot snow, right? So they were burning so many calories and suffering so many other ways that, you know, and they were doing this all on behalf of the rest of on behalf of their families and their traveling companions. So.
Well, we've got another comment.
Yeah. Jack
says, are some of you familiar with Kenneth Roberts' story Boone Island? It's a similarly harrowing true story of a shipwreck off the coast of Maine back in the 18th or early 19th century. I actually don't know anything about it.
I haven't heard that one.
Mm-hmm. Goodness.
The only other story I knew that was similar was it was the soccer team in the 1970s, and there was a plane crash in the Andes, and it was several months before anybody found them, and they ate their dead teammates to survive.
All right. I'm writing down Boone Island to look into.
Yeah, look into that. And the name of that book, I think the library has that book. It's called Alive.
Yeah.
It's the story of that soccer team.
Speaking of before everybody heads off to sweet dreams, can we invite you all to join us again next month for another evening like this with a different topic? Tiffany, you want to tell us about next month?
Yeah, we're talking about the Bell Witch. I don't know if you guys know anything about that, but it's a really interesting story. It's really interesting, and I'm not going to tell you anything about it because I want you to come next month. So
that sounds familiar, but much else besides it sounds familiar.
Witches and ghosts and hauntings and Tennessee.
It's an amazing ghost story.
I think it's set about the same time period too, isn't it?
Yeah, something around that.
Mid 1800s, I think.
Meanwhile, in Tennessee.
Yes. Meanwhile.
Yes.
On the East Coast.
And sorry we had some technical issues. I wish you could have seen the Rick Byrne clips. He does a much better job at explaining
yes,
than
please,
I did.
Please
but
go
it's
watch it. It's really good.
There's also a movie called The Donner Party, but I didn't get a chance to watch that. It came out in about 2012. And I think that might be available through Canopi if you guys wanted to watch that.
Shout out for library resources. These things are all available on our streaming video. We have,
and normally it works.
And normally, yeah, it works like a charm with a library card.
If you're not trying to show people, it works.
The Indifferent Stars Above, we have actual physical copies of, and then there's also an ebook version. And that's the most recent book about the Donner Party. And then the one that Mason's showing. The
best land under heaven, which is, it's a nice, comprehensive, very colorful, nice, poetically described story of a wagon train west. So it's a soothing read until you get to the difficult part, but it paints a picture of what emigrating across the continent would be like. So it's a jaw-dropping picture of what the enormity of that expedition, what they carried, and how to wrap your head around this incredible journey.
Gotta love Manifest Destiny.
Yeah. This is really colorful history.
Always. All right. Does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns?
Jack said that he thought the book that he was talking, that the Roberts book.
Okay.
He thought the library had a copy of that.
If there is,
Kenneth?
I will track it down. I'm good for that.
Oh, hi, Jack. I see you now. All right. Any comments? Anything before we sign off?
With that,
Oh, thank you, Valerie.
Hi, Valerie.
You guys have been great.
Oh yeah, and that's our list of resources, which we'll have a video of this up eventually. Sometimes it takes us a little while, but I definitely highly recommend any of the resources that we use here. And there's a lot of good stuff online, but sometimes you have to
dig a little.
You have to fact check it because some of it's more sensational.
What? Everything on the internet?
It's not true.
Correct?
It's not true. So I definitely relied on more nerdy sources because I feel like, like the History Channel and things like that. National Geographic, they had some good stuff.
We're just a bunch of nerds over here. It's fine.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming.
You've been great.
Bye, Mason.
good evening, everyone.
Farewell.
Music's a good choice too.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you. That's all
Very
Mason.
much.
He's been working hard on that.
We could have known that.
He's our showman.
Not ready for prime time.
And hopefully we'll have less technical issues with the Bell Witch. So just
We'll be fine.
be patient with us.
just
We're
gonna be
we're trying to
topics,
figure it out.
There's some more glitches.
Yeah. Yep. All right.
Thanks for joining us. Good to see everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. I think I probably should have signed into the video. I think that might be why it stopped working because I think it needs a library card after a certain point.
Yeah.
It might.
I bet that's what happened. See, I'm learning. I figure it out.
Logging out of this one.
All right.
Out of this one.
Okay. Stop share.
There's Tiffany.
Yeah. Lord.
And
Push the wrong
Is that
button.
a fake background?
Yes. Yes, it is. Look at how fancy I am with my fake background. And my
I know, it looks like a real library behind you.
It does.
So is it just us?
Yeah, it's just us now. Hello.
Oh, hello. It's the chef.
yum yum.
Who's calling me?
Somebody called me too, and I
Yeah.
was like, not right now.
Hello?
Oh my goodness.
Hey,
Hello.
put the phone up. I'm
I
talking
need
to you.
I need a recipe for human leg. Can you
Need
help me out?
ribs.
I'm asking
And
for a
ribs.
friend.
I need some human rib recipes.
I'm having a friend for dinner tonight.
I think we should use like the North Carolina barbecue sauce. Is it North
Okay,
Carolina
guys.
versus South Carolina?
You do realize that all of this is still recording?
Yeah, North Carolina cannibalism and South Carolina cannibalism. It's always a hot contest about who's got the original cannibalism.
See, I still think Tennessee has the best barbecue, but they don't even rank here. Nobody even talks about them.
Just sad.
But I do feel like the North Carolina sauce might be better for human flesh.
People's is people's.
All the vinegar just kind of takes it out. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll make sure Shantae cuts this off.
Dinner's on me.
What if she doesn't? Just have a bloopers reel at the end.
Womp womp. I know. I felt like when I couldn't get the dang PowerPoint to work, I was like, oh no. And then the dang movie wouldn't work. And I don't know how I sound. I would not want to listen to me.
No, actually, you did a really good job.
You sound
really did.
You sound great. You did amazing. You basically you were the show, and
I was just
and it
trying to
worked.
remember everything because at one
Yeah.
point I was like, I'm totally off script. I have no idea what's going on.
Yeah,
I'm just going to keep talking. And that's why I ended up repeating things you and I had talked about and you put in your portion.
But it was amazing. Johnny Carson also doesn't remember any of his shows.
But that's because he's drunk.
How many did we have? Did you guys count?
18.
18. That's pretty good.
18 attendees, probably with couples and.
Did people stay?
Yes, everybody stayed all the way.
Yeah,
through.
everybody stayed like the entire time. We did not have a single dropout.
What?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah. It's amazing.
That's awesome. I'm so pumped.
I can't wait to be like, boom, Sean. Boom.
Oh my gosh.
Hi, Cookie Monster.
All right, guys.
Bye, Bobby.
We should go do things.
Bye, Mason.
Stuff.
Don't eat me, Cookie Monster.
Just make sure you cook them first. Cook people first.
I seriously would eat on bark before I would start eating people. I would eat as much bark as possible.
I know that I would have an issue as long as I didn't know what
really fill
part
up on
I was eating. If
Well,
it was
that's why they
indis-
labeled the meat. That was very considerate.
It was like, if it's indiscriminate, just meat, I can just pretend that it's not.
They
So I'm
decided that you shouldn't have to eat your mom. I thought that was very considerate.
That was very nice.
But I like the Garth Brooks, by the way.
It looks very official.
It works good,
It
right?
looks like I work at a call center.
In your background,
Sure.
like you're the Oregon Trail
I love that.
call center.
Reporting live from the Oregon Trail.
Yes. It's amazing.
All right, I got to go
I'm in
relieve
this.
Ivani because she's
Okay.
going to have a meltdown. She doesn't want to be on
Yes.
IPS.
Go do the thing.
She's very upset that she's on IPS.
Ooh, yeah.
Man,
She's
oh man.
never worked
Get her.
IPS before, and somebody put her over there.